China and the US might be painted as rivals today, their flags waving on opposite sides of a tense global stage. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find a story that ties them tight, a human thread woven through time. Back in the 18th century, when Chinese villagers from places like Taishan faced floods, famine, and chaos, they didn't see an enemy across the Pacific. They saw hope. Young men, hearts heavy with duty, sailed to America, building railroads and dreams in places like Texas. That migration, born of hardship and grit, isn't just history. It's a bridge between two nations, binding them in ways no headline can erase. Let's hop in a time machine and zoom back to the mid-18th century, when the seeds of a lesser-known story between China and Texas were being planted. Guangdong in the mid-18th century, a little corner of China where life was throwing punches, left and right. Imagine a place where the ground itself seemed to turn against you, where young guys barely out of their teens had to make choices that'd break your heart. I'm talking about why and how folks from Taishan ended up in Texas, of all places, chasing a lifeline for their families. This isn't just history, it's a story of grit, sacrifice, and dreams tougher than the storms they faced. The Qing dynasty, which was running China then, was crumbling under its own weight. Corruption was rampant, and local officials often squeezed villagers for taxes they couldn't pay. On top of that, the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, a massive civil war, sent shockwaves through southern China. Guangdong wasn't the main battlefield, but it felt the ripple effects. Villages were disrupted, trade routes collapsed, and young men were sometimes dragged into militias or caught in the crossfire. Taishan, a rural area, was especially vulnerable because it didn't have the wealth or defenses of bigger cities like Guangzhou. Then came the famines. Guangdong's farmland depended on a delicate balance of weather and irrigation, but in the 1850s and 1860s, droughts and poor harvests hit hard. Families who relied on rice and vegetables to survive were suddenly staring at empty bowls. In Taishan, where most people were subsistence farmers, a bad harvest didn't just mean hunger, it meant watching your kids or parents waste away. I read somewhere that entire villages would pool what little they had, but when the rice ran out, there was no safety net. People were forced to eat roots or leave to find work elsewhere. And if that wasn't enough, floods made things even worse. The Pearl River Delta, where Taishan sits, was prone to monsoon-driven flooding. When the rains came too hard, rivers overflowed, wiping out crops, homes, and sometimes whole villages. Imagine waking up to find your fields underwater, your house collapsing, and no way to start over. For Taishanese families, these floods weren't just natural disasters, they were a signal that staying put might mean death. During that period in Texas, there was a demand for labor in the post-American Civil War environment. Railroad companies in particular wanted workers to rebuild their infrastructure. In the meantime, Taishanese hear stories from labor recruiters or relatives about places like California or Texas, where you could work on railroads or farms and earn real money. Not to get rich, mind you, but to send cash back home so their parents could eat, their siblings could marry, or their kids could have a shot at something better. In Taishan, there was this culture of duty. Your family came first, no question. So these guys, often in their teens or 20s, would sign up with agents who promised passage to America. Now, getting to Texas wasn't a simple boat ride. Most of these young men took what's called the credit ticket system. Basically, a merchant or labor broker would front the money for their ship fare. Think of it like a loan with brutal terms. In return, they'd work off the debt in America, often for years. They'd sail from ports like Hong Kong, crammed into ships that were more like floating sardine cans, enduring storms, disease, and months at sea. If they landed in San Francisco first, which many did, they might hear about jobs in Texas, say building the Houston and Texas Central Railway, and make their way there by train or wagon. It was grueling, and plenty didn't survive the journey or the work that followed. Once they got to Texas, these young Taishanese men weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. They faced racism, low wages, and backbreaking jobs, laying tracks, picking fruit, or running laundries. But they kept at it, sending money back to Taishan through remittance networks. Those dollars rebuilt homes, paid off debts, and kept villages alive. Some planned to return once they'd saved enough, but many ended up staying, laying the roots for Chinese communities in places like Houston or San Antonio. What's wild is how much Taishan shaped this migration. It wasn't just random. Taishan's location, its poverty, and its tight-knit clans meant that once a few guys made it to Texas and sent word back, others followed. By the 1880s, Taishan was like a pipeline to the US, with whole neighborhoods in Texas full of folks who knew each other from back home. They'd share letters, news, even tips on dodging the Chinese Exclusion Act when it kicked in later, so yeah, that's the heart of it. These young men from Taishan weren't chasing the American dream in some glossy way. They were fighting to keep their families afloat in a world that seemed hell-bent on breaking them. Political unrest, famine, and floods weren't just background noise. They were the push that sent them across the ocean to Texas, carrying their hopes and their duty on their backs. In 1880, Robertson County in U.S. Texas state had 72 ethnic Chinese, while the other 64 were elsewhere in the state. Beyond the Cantonese from Taishan and Guangdong made their way to Texas. The Cantonese were the first big wave, no doubt, but over time, folks from other parts of China, with their own languages, cultures, and struggles, started showing up too. Think of it like a tapestry getting richer with new threads. Each group had its own reasons and paths to Texas, shaped by what was happening in China and the pull of opportunity across the ocean. Fast forward a bit from the 1850s Taishan days. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, people from Fujian province on China's southeast coast started trickling into Texas. Fujian's a place of rugged mountains and bustling ports like Fuzhou and Xiamen, and its folks, especially the Hokkien and Fuzhou people, were known for being scrappy traders and seafarers. The Hakka, the wandering survivors, ethnic Chinese known as the guest people because they were always on the move within China. The Hakka didn't have one home province. They were scattered across Guangdong, Fujian, and beyond, but a good chunk in Guangdong's Meizhou area joined the Texas story. The Hakka were tough as nails, but they had it rough. They were often outsiders in their own land, clashing with Cantonese locals over resources. By the late 18th century, these tensions, small-scale riots or land disputes, pushed some Hakka to look abroad. Droughts hit Meizhou hard, and when the crops failed, there was no safety net. The Hakka were also caught in China's bigger storms, rebellions, wars, you name it. For them, migration wasn't new. They'd been moving for centuries. So when word spread about jobs in America, some Hakka men jumped at it. They followed the Cantonese routes, Hong Kong to San Francisco, then maybe Texas by the 1870s for railroad work or farming in places like Robertson County. Others came later, post-1943, when immigration laws loosened. The Northerners, from places like Shandong, Jiangsu, or even Shanghai. These folks were latecomers to Texas, mostly showing up after World War II and especially post-1965, when U.S. immigration laws opened up. Up north, life was different. No Guangdong-style floods, but plenty of trouble. Shandong's farmers dealt with droughts and bandit raids, and the Japanese invasion, 1937 to 1945, turned everything upside down. War and then Mao's policies, like the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, which starved millions, made staying put feel like a trap. For Northerners, Texas wasn't on the radar until later. After 1949, when the communists took over, lots of educated Northerners fled, first to Taiwan or Hong Kong, then places like Texas. They came legally, often as students or professionals, landing in Houston's medical centers or Austin's universities by the 1970s. Shanghai folks, used to city life, fit right into Dallas's business scene, opening firms or joining tech startups. By the 2000s, Texas was pulling in Chinese from all over. China's opening up meant more people could leave, and Texas was a hotspot for jobs, schools, and affordable living. HH-1B visas for skilled workers, F-1s for students, or green cards through family. Some, especially from poorer areas, took shadier routes, smuggling networks via Mexico, though that's rarer. In Texas, these newer groups mixed into places like Sugarland or Plano, where Chinatowns aren't just Cantonese anymore. You'll hear Mandarin, Wu, even Sichuanese dialects in bubble tea shops or mega churches. So, while Taishan's Cantonese kicked things off, Fujianese brought their hustle, Hakka their resilience, and Northerners their smarts. Later, everyone from Zhejiang to Sichuan added their own spice. Each group had its own push: war, hunger, politics, or just a shot at something bigger and its own way of getting to Texas, from rickety ships to jumbo jets. Together, they turned Texas into a Chinese-American mosaic where a Houston food court might serve Hokkien noodles next to Sichuan hot pot. Most Chinese Americans live in California and New York. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, about half of Chinese-born immigrants resided in these two states. California, especially areas like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and the San Gabriel Valley, has the largest Chinese-American population, with vibrant Chinatowns and suburban communities. New York City, particularly Manhattan's Chinatown, Flushing, and Brooklyn, is another major hub, especially for newer Fujianese immigrants. Other notable areas include New Jersey, Texas, and Washington, but California and New York dominate due to long-standing communities and economic opportunities. Chinese immigrants faced a grueling fight for U.S. citizenship and equal rights, confronting systemic racism, discriminatory laws, and violent hostility from the moment they arrived in the mid-18th century. Lured by the California gold rush and jobs building the Transcontinental Railroad, tens of thousands of Chinese, mostly from Guangdong province, came seeking opportunity. Instead, they were met with suspicion and scapegoated as threats to white workers, branded the Yellow Peril. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was a devastating setback, the first U.S. law to single out an ethnic group. It banned Chinese laborers from entering the country and barred all Chinese, even long-term residents, from becoming citizens. This left many in limbo, working low-wage jobs, unable to vote, and vulnerable to exploitation. Families were torn apart as men couldn't bring wives or children from China, creating bachelor societies in Chinatowns. The law also fueled local restrictions, like San Francisco's 1870s ordinances, taxing Chinese businesses or banning traditional cues, braided hair. U.S.-born Chinese, guaranteed citizenship under the 14th Amendment, still faced second-class treatment. California's alien land laws, 1913 to 1920, targeted aliens ineligible for citizenship, a clear jab at Asians, preventing Chinese immigrants from owning farmland or property, crushing dreams of economic stability. Violence was a constant threat. Mobs attacked Chinese communities, like the 1871 Los Angeles massacre, 17 to 20 killed, or Denver's 1880 riot, where Luk Young was lynched and Chinatown razed. Perpetrators rarely faced consequences, emboldening further aggression. Chinese Americans fought back with grit and ingenuity. In 1898, Wong Kim Ark, a San Francisco-born Chinese American, won a landmark Supreme Court case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark, affirming birthright citizenship for children of immigrants, a victory still foundational today. Community organizations like the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, 6 companies, raised funds, offered legal aid, and rallied against exclusion. Individuals like Ng Poon Chu, a journalist, spoke out in newspapers, while others smuggled relatives past harsh immigration checks at Angel Island, dubbed the Ellis Island of the West, where detainees endured interrogations and detentions lasting weeks or months. Change was agonizingly slow. The Exclusion Act lasted until 1943, repealed only because China was a U.S. ally in World War II. Even then, a meager quota of 105 Chinese immigrants per year was set, and naturalization remained limited. After the war, the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act eased some restrictions, allowing small numbers to become citizens. But it wasn't until the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that quotas were scrapped, opening doors for Chinese families to reunite and naturalize on equal terms. By the late 20th century, Chinese Americans were making strides, voting, running for office, and building thriving businesses. Figures like San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee and activists like Grace Lee Boggs showed their growing influence. Yet challenges lingered, from workplace discrimination to spikes in anti-Chinese sentiment, like during the 1982 killing of Vincent Chin, mistaken for Japanese, or the xenophobia tied to COVID-19's origins in Wuhan. Each generation's push for justice built on the last, securing a fuller place in America's promise of equality. Early Chinese Americans faced brutal prejudice, discrimination, and violence in the U.S. In 1880, a 3,000-strong mob in Denver, fueled by yellow peril fears and election hype, rioted against Chinese immigrants. They lynched a man named Look Young and destroyed nearly all of Chinatown. About 185 Chinese men were jailed for 3 days for their safety, while most arrested rioters walked free, and Look Young's killers were acquitted. In 1871, a mob of 500 in Los Angeles massacred 17 to 20 Chinese immigrants after a local rancher's accidental death, marking one of the largest mass lynchings in U.S. history. In 1885, the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming saw white miners, angry over job competition, kill at least 28 Chinese, injure 15, and burn 78 homes. Many Chinese fled, only to die from starvation, exposure, or predators, though some were saved by a passing train. The 1887 Hell's Canyon Massacre left at least 34 Chinese miners dead, likely shot by horse thieves during a robbery. Other attacks hit Chinese communities in San Francisco, 1877, Issaquah and Tacoma, 1885, Squaw Valley, 1885, Seattle, 1886, and the Pacific Coast, 1907. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic, linked to Wuhan, China, sparked a wave of xenophobia and racism against Chinese people and those perceived as Chinese. As of the 2022 American Community Survey, about 5.5 million people in the U.S. identified as Chinese American, either fully, 4.3 million, or partially, 1.2 million. Back in 2010, the Chinese American population was around 3.8 million, with half of those born in China living in California or New York. In the 1980s, many Chinese Americans traced their roots to Taishan in southern China, mostly speaking Cantonese or Taishanese and hailing from Guangdong province. That decade also saw more Mandarin-speaking immigrants arrive from northern China and Taiwan. By the 1990s, a big wave of Fujianese immigrants, many undocumented, settled in places like New York City. Before the 1990s, most Chinese Americans lived in the western U.S., especially California and Nevada, or in New York City.